The mandate of heaven is a Chinese political and spiritual concept that goes back to ancient times to explain the state of Chinese society and that of the emperor's authority. It is said that if an emperor has power, he has received the heavenly mandate to rule. Yet if misfortune befalls China, heaven has removed that same mandate accordingly. In the case of Mao Zedong, who rose to prominence in the aftermath of the Second World War and the turmoil that ensued in China as the Japanese Empire surrendered and communist and nationalist forces vied for control of Beijing, his reign as de facto emperor of China from 1949 to 1976 was a tumultuous one. After implementing sweeping land reforms, plunging headlong into a war with the United States and Korea, and despite overturning the country's economic base that led to tens of millions dead from starvation, Mao's political control never seemed to waver. Communist China, caught up in the revolution of standing up for itself against foreign powers, never seemed to be able to stand up to its emperor.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
A military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostage.
It's been time theater.
На полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. Today we are joined by an extremely special guest from TRS and Fascination, Ethnarch. He came on the scene probably about 2 months ago, and if you've been listening to that platform, you recognize a very keen geopolitical mind that came on out of nowhere. We didn't know, where he was all his life, but he's been living abroad for some of that, and he's an expat, and he has an incredible knowledge of Asia, the political strategies that are going on between the Asian powers and the United States, and he's sort of a self-described paleocon, and he's kind of new to the alt-right scene, but I would say, bread and butter, paleocon type of guy. Extremely smart. We're honored to have him on. Ethnarch, please say hello.
Well, hi, and I don't know what to say after that glowing introduction. You're very kind, and thanks for setting the bar low for me. I hope I don't disappoint. But thanks for having me on the show. I'm a great fan of Myth of the 20th Century. The first episode of yours I ever listened to was actually Uncle Ted's Cabin, about the Unabomber, and I was hooked. And I've gone through the back catalog, and honored to be here with you gentlemen, because you have a great podcast and a lot of good insight.
Yeah, the honor's all ours. Let me introduce my co-hosts who are joining me today. So Hank, please say hello.
Hi, everyone.
Alex.
Hello.
And last but not least, Nick.
Hey, how you getting on?
So today we're trying to wrap our heads around the largest by population country in the world, China, and how it came to be such a hegemonic force that we know it as today. It wasn't always that way, though, and after the Second World War, it was undergoing a great period of turmoil. So we thought we'd start the clock around that period and kick it off with Mao gaining power in, I believe it was 48. But let's start the conversation at 45, when the Second World War concludes with the treaty in, was it Japan or Europe that surrendered first? I can't remember, but it was one
Europe
of those.
surrendered first.
Yeah, so I guess it was actually the end of the war close by in Japan. So let's kick it off there. What was going on in China at the time?
Well, you had China in the 20th century has been it was all upheaval almost all the way, and so there had been the Second World War, obviously, and you had two rival factions, the Kuomintang or KMT, and then the Chinese Communist Party, who at various times had formed a united front to fight the Japanese. And it was actually the Kuomintang who did most of the fighting. The the Chinese Communist Party actually didn't do very much. They wanted to husband their forces for the post-war period to be able to take power. And so you had a situation in which the American government, the United States government, and the Allies were favoring the Kuomintang, but in many ways were not very happy with the Kuomintang. And you also had a situation in which Stalin in the Soviet Union had been urging the Communist Party of China to go slow and not to push for instant revolution and to form a united front with the KMT. And so you basically have both great power blocks right after the Second World War, pretty much either pro KMT or leaning towards KMT. And you had this huge desolation. It's important to remember that during the Second World War, 80% of the Japanese army was actually in territorial China. The Americans fighting across the Pacific fought roughly 20% of that army. And so, huge swaths of the countryside were devastated. It was a huge dislocation, very comparable to the dislocation and destruction that had taken place in the Soviet Union. If that's a decent
the Japanese
analogy.
had invaded Manchuria, which I think they believe they renamed Manchukuo, and I think that was in the 20s. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah, and I did not know that such a large percentage of their military was used in occupying that swathe of land. And to my knowledge, it wasn't all that strategic when it came down to some of the war effort. I would imagine perhaps they were getting some light industry out of it, but China was very underdeveloped at the time, and so other than resources,
the Japanese had sunk a lot of capital in the 30s into Manchukuo, the Showa Steelworks, I think it was called, pretty substantial steel production. I mean, Japan, of course, didn't have that much industrial production, but the part of China that Japan was running was the most developed part of China.
Certainly.
A bunch of weird kind of inter-Japanese dynamics where the army wanted its own chunk of glory, and of course, if you have the choice between a Pacific campaign that's going to heavily rely on naval forces, the army is going to want to, get to the largest big landmass and do some conquering there. And they didn't have very unified kind of political leadership. They had a lot of implicit political instability running up to the Second World War.
That's exactly right. And the Japanese army was actually a state within a state, right? And they viewed Manchukuo as being a resource base and an economic base for them to have their own power base and continue that throughout the war and in what they envisage as a victorious post-war period.
And so when the Japanese lost the war, was that the end of the occupation at the same time? Was that concurrent with the surrender to the Americans in China? Were they basically surrendering at the same time?
It took quite a bit of time to get all that resolved and to get demobilization and everything else. By that point in time, the Japanese, were in Manchukuo, were in a defensive, a relatively defensive posture. The KMT had done a decent job overall. If you look at the entire timeline of the struggle, they had done a decent job of fighting the Japanese, holding the line when they could. They had their incompetencies, they had their defeats, and everything else. It was very much a back and forth kind of thing. But it took a bit to get disengagement there. But by and large, the huge overt hostilities had stopped by that point in time, which really kind of set the stage for the Chinese Civil War.
Remember, the Soviets are invading in August 45, so just after the war in Europe's over, they're pushing into Manchuria.
That's right, and that was actually one of the big bones of contention that the Allies had with the Soviet Union, was getting them to declare war on Japan and then do something, and they did so, of course, at the absolute most opportune moment, right?
So when the war concludes, there are in China these sort of rival factions of Chinese forces. You have Mao's platoon or army of 90,000 soldiers, I think, and I think he later calls it the People's Liberation Army, of course. I don't know what their designation was at the time. And then you had the Kuomintang, the nationalist government, which was officially recognized by the United States. How did those two entities interact during the war, and then how did they suddenly? I mean, I would imagine they were somewhat, aligned against the Japanese, but I'm wondering, if that was true, and then also, how did they suddenly then come at each other after the war? Because obviously, the Kuomintang went away. They went to Taiwan mostly, so, and they were the official government. So obviously, there's a huge change there.
So the Kuomintang were founded along Leninist lines as well as the Communist Party of China, for that matter. And there was originally when both parties were founded, there was a great deal of interaction, and Zhou Enlai, for example, was one of the top commissars in the Kuomintang originally. You don't read that in histories from China these days, but he was. And so there was cooperation, and eventually Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the Kuomintang, had decided that he wanted to he saw what the danger that the communists represented, and he decided to purge the communists. And there was a big bloody purge. This took place in the 1920s, and so then there was separation. And then during World War II, there was essentially a united front.
That makes sense. So when the Japanese are defeated, how long until the communists and the nationalists start actually shooting at each other? Do you know?
It's pretty immediate, and initially the nationalists were doing quite well, and they dealt some pretty stunning defeats to the Red Army, which is what Mao called his force at that time. But then Lin Biao took charge and was able to turn the tables and inflicted defeat after defeat on the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang were not fighting really a war of maneuver. They were very much tied to protecting specific cities and infrastructure pieces. And the legend is that Mao launched this brilliant guerrilla campaign, and that's what that he did this first of all during World War II and inflicted these great losses on the Japanese, and then he did the same thing to the nationalists. But that's not what actually happened. During World War II, the Chinese Communist Party talked a lot, but they didn't have that much in terms of engagement with the Japanese. They mainly talked a lot and let the Kuomintang do the bulk of the fighting, because they wanted to husband their forces for the post-war period to have it out with KMT. And so then after the war, there was this huge conflict, the Chinese Civil War, and the Red Army engaged in a very much a Soviet-style war of maneuver against the Kuomintang, and ended up inflicting defeat after defeat on them. And finally, the Kuomintang realized that it simply wasn't tenable, and so, like you said, they ended up withdrawing across the strait into Taiwan, and so that sealed the victory of the Chinese Communist Party and Mao's Red Army, who then declared in 1949 that they declared the People's Republic of China, and Mao very famously said, "China has stood up."
Well, go ahead, Alex.
Ethnarch, I wonder if you have any knowledge about U.S. shipments, U.S. Basically money that was sent to the Kuomintang to run their war machine, and the massive amount of embezzlement. I mean, I've read things ranging from buying of silver was causing a recession in China to just outright embezzlement by the leadership, elements in the leadership of the Kuomintang, basically just bled their forces or deprived their forces of the resources that would have made them have an easy victory, really.
Well, Alex, before Ednark answers, I just want to add that the Kuomintang was a major source for narcotics trafficking prior to this period, and I will be talking about this in an upcoming episode, not specifically on China, but I would just throw that in.
Yeah, they're a dirty group of people.
Yeah, well, there are no good guys there, right? And so, yeah, there was corruption and embezzlement in the Kuomintang. I mean, there's corruption and embezzlement in the Communist Party of China. The narrative in the West about the Kuomintang and about Chiang Kai-shek in particular is a very, very deeply slanted narrative. General Joe Stilwell, who was the American general who was the primary military liaison between the United States and the Kuomintang, conceived an intense personal dislike of Chiang. And you also had a very influential group of State Department employees who were, communist fellow travelers and very literally pro-communist, who constantly were pushing the Roosevelt administration to disengage from the Kuomintang and instead support the Communist Party. And these people, of course, end up writing history books. And so they portrayed Chiang and the Kuomintang as cowardly, feckless, inept. And that's not true. Yes, they suffered defeats from time to time. Yes, they certainly had corruption and embezzlement, but nothing that was out of the ordinary for that place and that time and that part of the world. So both the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek personally get a really undeserved bad rap in most of the mainstream historical accounts, in my opinion.
I'm curious if you could give your opinion on how accurate is the portrayal of the Kuomintang, at least, as being quote-unquote nationalist, because a lot of what I think the rhetoric in Asia was at the time, and you can see this right now in Korea, is trying to get rid of like the Western imperialists. They use that term a lot, and in China, I think they still use that propaganda term because it's obviously not true anymore, but it certainly was when the sort of days of the Shanghai merchant vessels passing through, making that entire waterfront look essentially like almost a European city, much like Hong Kong was. It was basically this entrepot of European imperial powers, and I think they called it spheres of influence. They didn't quite control the territory, but they were basically fighting.
They had concessions all over China.
Sure.
Powers. Sure. There's gorgeous French buildings in Guangzhou and Shanghai, even to this day.
Right. And the sort of, I think the drug trade aspect that Nick was mentioning is particularly interesting because that has legacy with the British, obviously, with the opium coming from their territories in Afghanistan and then being used to try to counterbalance the balance of trade deficit. Sounds familiar, right? With China that they had, and that I think that is still used as sort of justification for kicking out these foreign devils. These what do they call them? Guilos or something like that. There's a term.
Laowai.
Thank you.
Laowai. Yeah.
Yeah, and
yeah.
Or if a really bad one is Yang Guizi, with Yang is European and Guizi is like a ghost, so a European devil.
Right. So how actually independent were these nationalists? I mean, forgetting whatever the Roosevelt propagandists were telling us, what is your take?
This was a struggle for the control of China, and so this plays into a concept that the Chinese call the century of humiliation, right? In which China had a relatively little control over her own borders, and this goes back to the Taiping Rebellion, which was hugely disruptive in China and really distracted the Manchu dynasty. And so then you had the Opium Wars. There were actually two of them, and I have a little bit of a different take on part of the Opium War. We talked about a bit on Fascination Focus that opium use was actually fairly common within China and in the upper classes, and they had a relatively pure product. But what happened was you had the Sassoon family, who were actually Baghdadi Jews who ended up immigrating to what became Hong Kong and ended up financing the opium trade into China, from the British. And so what was really happening here was there was a ton of greed with this influx of opium, because the idea was to make the product more affordable, right, to the lower classes. And so they kept diluting the product and stepping on the product so much that there were all these, horrible ill effects. And so it was just a little bit different story than just the evil foreigners, poisoning the poor Chinese people with opium, because the Chinese were very complicit in the opium trade themselves, and a lot of the ill effects were caused by their greed and stepping on the product. But that being said, you had the opium wars, you had the end of the Taiping Rebellion with the burning of the Summer Palace. You had all of this disruption. You had the Boxer Rebellion, the concessions in Shanghai and other places where Chinese law did not apply. It literally did not apply. The foreigners were governed by their own laws, even though they were territorially within China. And so China didn't have control. Go ahead. Sorry.
Just this is where you get the on no dogs or Chinese.
That's right. No dogs or Chinese allowed. That's exactly right. And so this is the century of humiliation, where China was had no control over its territory and its own destiny. And that's what Mao really meant when he said China has stood up. That finally China was, quote, whole again, unquote, in his view.
And when you talk about like China has stood up and that you're no longer lacking control, it's not like the average Chinese peasant at the height of Chinese imperial power and internal dominance, external dominance, had any control over their own lives. What they're really talking about is that like the Chinese elite has seized control of China, like full stop. That they're now like able to be ruled by themselves. Like you're still going to be ruled, but now at least it's going to be a Chinese dude on top, I suppose.
Initially, yes, that's true. And that's kind of like, what is it, Frederick the Great, who said that the Prussian yeomanry should neither know nor care with whom the state was at war, right? And so yes, and typically in China, up until the time of the Chinese Civil War, no matter who was ruling China, whether it was the various Chinese dynasty, whether it was the Yuan or the Mongol dynasty for that matter, the involvement of the national government halted. It didn't go below what we would call the county level, right? And so the collection of taxes, levies of corvée labor, all of those different kinds of things were actually organized by local notables within each of the individual counties and regions. And so, yes, you're right. Up until that point in time, the average life of the peasant didn't change that much unless, he got conscripted by the Taiping, for example, or killed by them, or conscripted or killed in any of the other innumerable wars that the Chinese fought. But that changed once the Chinese Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War. This is a fundamental change that Mao and the party made, was to involve politics, and the party asked the controlling element of China down into the lives, down to the peasants themselves. And this pervasiveness of government was a new thing in the history of China after the communists consolidated their power.
Maybe we can cover the Korean War, just because it's a million dead and sort of their first attempt at attacking a foreign power, aside from the Japanese, I guess.
Yeah, let's do Korea.
Okay. So if I remember correctly, it starts in 1950, and I'm a little bit rusty on the details of who shot first, but it basically involved, I guess, the first instance of the superpowers directly or indirectly going into conflict on a part of the world that wasn't their own territory. So it had a pretty strong geopolitical significance, and the conflict obviously was between North and South Korea, which had sort of parallels with North and South Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. But the long and short of it was the World War II military of America was actively engaged using Japan as a jumping off point to retake Korea from the North Koreans who had invaded South Korea. And they were actually very successful at it until the Chinese entered the scene. So maybe there, Ethnarch, if you have any comments, you can fill us in on what happened.
Well, sure. So very briefly, the Soviet Union had occupied the northern portion of the Korean Peninsula during the Second World War. And after the war was over, there was a line of demarcation, the DMZ, drawn at the 38th parallel. And so you had the Soviets working with Kim Il-sung to set up a government in Northern Korea. And then you had the South Koreans, and they ended up with Syngman Rhee, who was a well-known because the Korean Peninsula had been occupied by the Japanese starting earlier in the 20th century. And Syngman Rhee was a well-known anti-Japanese colonial activist who had ended up being an expat in the United States. And so they brought Dr. Rhee back to run the government in the ROK. And what happened very specifically was that Syngman Rhee was a fairly troublesome ally for the United States. He actually kept pushing the U.S. to do something about the communist regime in the North, and was very troublesome. And so I believe it was Dean Rusk, if I recall correctly, gave a speech talking about the United States, the assumed commitments they had made in the Pacific to shield perceived allied countries against Soviet expansionism. And he very deliberately left out South Korea, and it was intended as a snub to get the South Koreans to pipe down. But then you have Kim Il-sung, who is paying attention to this. He says, well, I'm going to take, obviously the Americans don't really care what happens. And so he went to Stalin and basically sold Stalin on the idea of the North invading the South and pushing the relatively light U.S. forces off the peninsula and reuniting the Korean Peninsula under communist rule. And Stalin agreed and gave logistical support, and so that's how the Korean War kicked off. And the communists were at first very, very successful. They kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and eventually there was a relatively tight perimeter around the port of Busan, where Task Force Smith was holding on. And so then General MacArthur was in Japan in the Daiichi, and as you said, they essentially used Japan as a logistical base and aircraft carrier really to pump forces back in to Korea. And then MacArthur, of course, launched his famous amphibious hook in Incheon landing, and they were very, very successful in pushing the North Korean forces back. And the majority of the Korean War actually was fought on North Korean territory, and they pushed and pushed and pushed. There was carpet bombings, from B-29s. You had TAC air with like F-4 Corsairs dropping napalm. I mean, this was a not some small brush fire kind of deal. This was actually a major application of air power mechanized warfare on the part of the UN forces with MacArthur under command, and they breezed right through Pyongyang, and were rapidly approaching the Yalu River and the border with China. And Mao decided that he didn't want to have a U.S. ally, sitting on his border at the Yalu River, and so he got these quote 300,000 quote volunteers unquote, so he could have some plausible deniability that it wasn't really the Chinese Red Army, okay. Yeah, you're right, invading. And so he managed to infiltrate, if you believe it or not, because this is an era before satellites and all the very sophisticated technology we have today. And so he infiltrated 300,000 Chinese troops who were could live on a handful of rice a day, very tough. And infiltrated them into the northern portion of Korea, and then launched a surprise attack, and ended up pushing the U.S.-led UN forces back ultimately to the 38th parallel. It's the only time in history to date that the U.S. Marine Corps has actually retreated. The very famous fighting retreat from the Shozan Reservoir, and this was
didn't
Mao's
they push them back to Pusan at one point?
That was earlier in the war. No, the Chi-Coms with the Norks together pushed them back essentially to the 38th parallel, more or less, and that was fluid for a while. But this was Mao's, as you noted, his big debut on the world stage, and they lost something like a total of 1 million casualties, all told. The Chinese did in that war, but they had plenty to spare, as Mao was always pointing out. And to their credit, they could claim to have fought the United States led coalition, in the U.S. in particular, to a standstill on the Korean Peninsula, and this really cemented Mao's position as a leader of the international communist movement and as a potential rival to Stalin.
If I could just not disagree, I agree with what you just said, but I want to sort of add some nuance to that, in that the victory, so to speak, of the Chinese forces over the Americans came at a great cost. I believe they lost 1 million people. And I have an anecdote I think I mentioned during the Korean episode, that there was a documentary I saw once where they had a American-Korean War veteran talking about his experience fighting when the Chinese intervened. And the Chinese were just carrying basic rifles. I'm sure Alex or Hank could probably tell me which ones they were, but the Americans were carrying heavy machine guns in their pillboxes, and there was a position they had staked out at the top of a hill where this veteran was manning the gun, and he literally was describing the mountains of bodies that were falling before his position, to the point where his finger got tired from holding the trigger down, and just the asymmetry of the body toll was something that I think China really paid for. They obviously have a lot of people to begin with, but they paid a lot for it, and it wasn't even their country. And I'm wondering if there was actually any internal dissent in the Communist Party of China as a result of that great human toll. If you're aware of it, I'm not sure.
It was. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I don't mean to do all the talking. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I'm just curious if you know about any of the inside baseball, as we say in America, about what the party was doing, because Mao was a extremely clever political operator, or one that just basically would just eliminate his enemies. You don't necessarily have to be clever to do that, but he was very paranoid, and so I'm wondering if anybody was voicing dissent because of this.
No, quite the opposite. So at that point in time, Mao was riding high because Stalin had been urging Mao to go slow with revolution in China. He had been urging Mao, to maintain the United Front with the Kuomintang. At the time, when the objective conditions were not really suitable for revolution, and Mao totally disregarded that advice. And he, together with Lin Bao, put together this strategy that drove the Kuomintang, out of China, stood up the People's Republic of China, and Mao was really riding high at that point. He had embarked on a crash program of industrialization, and no, there was not a lot of dissent about this all. And yeah, they took 1 million casualties. Absolutely, they did. But number one, this is a drop in the bucket of China. And number two, it's important to understand that the popularity of the Chinese Communist Party, was manifest throughout China. It was not one of these affairs where you have a relatively thin elite, right, who are ideologically motivated, who rule it over the peasants. This, again, Mao politicized China down to the individual level of the peasant. And, with all the enthusiasm of converts, he had a huge groundswell of popular support. And he was termed the Great Helmsman. And so, no, there was not dissent about this at all. It was actually viewed with pride.
So I guess if we want to go to the Great Leap Forward, we can, I I guess, jump ahead, but was there anything also going on at the time? I do recall in some of my research that there was a lot of land reform going on that was possibly one of the reasons Mao had such popularity, was that he was taking the land previously owned by, I believe it was half the country, or half the land area, arable land, and he gave that actually over to the peasants. And this was before the Great Leap Forward, mind you. So this was essentially akin to perhaps what they did in Russia prior to the mass collectivization. Any quick clarification, if you have any, Ethnarch, on that?
Oh, yeah, that is what happened. So he did land reform and then, of course, turned around and snatched it back. And so what you'll see is that Mao was running basically 20 to 25 years behind the Soviet Union in terms of, trying things, and then they didn't work out, and making mistakes, and then having to deal with the consequences. And so he did exactly that. He did land reform. They had something that you could think of as somewhat analogous to the NEP that Lenin had tried, and then they ended up snatching it all back and collectivizing it. But yeah, that was a big reason for it. And the United States, had been involved in China and had fought in China during the Boxer Rebellion, and they were already perceived as relatively negative towards China by the communists, which, of course, one of the big reasons that the U.S., the Roosevelt administration, wanted to push the Japanese so far so that they ended up attacking the U.S. and bringing the U.S. into the Second World War, was because they were fascinated with China. They believed that the United States essentially had a white man's burden, to civilize China and bring them into the modern era and open up their markets and all this kind of stuff. And so Mao demonized the United States even prior to the Korean War, unfairly, actually. And after the Korean War, that really sealed the stance of China towards the United States. And so since that point in time, the U.S. has been, from a propaganda perspective, enemy number one. And they actually produced a very anti-American history book. I think it was in 1953, 1954, that was in the schools until the mid-1980s. And then they pulled it out during Deng Xiaoping's Great Opening. But they reintroduced that exact same textbook, unedited, back into the Chinese school curriculum in 2012, for what it's worth.
Well, let's do the Great Leap Forward.
Well, before we get to there, so one of the kind of interesting things that happens in this period that kind of shows some of the internal regime dynamics is the 100 Flowers campaign. So right. There's kind of a internal debate, I guess, within the leadership class of the Chinese Communist Party about who exactly is the party for, because they had kind of this, desire to be kind of this peasant-driven thing, where traditional Marxist-Leninist ideology would suggest, like, oh, well, you need the workers, you have to have an industrial base, you have to have factories, you have to have the factory workers before you can have a Marxist revolution. And China just had none of that. So the kind of role of intellectuals and of kind of a intellectual class within the party was sort of an open question. And around 1956 or so, the Chinese Communist Party, kind of personified by Mao, I guess, has the bright idea that they're going to start soliciting some of these kind of demoralized intellectuals that, hey, does anybody have anything they'd like to discuss, any issues you'd like to bring up? They solicit kind of this 100 schools of thought, let 100 flowers bloom. And initially the response is kind of muted because everybody is smart enough to realize, okay, we just went through 50 years of immense turmoil, 100 years of humiliation before that. Let's not be too hasty, to the point where Mao is actually implying that, well, people who insufficiently criticize the regime might in fact be punished. So you see this
is
sort
like
of
the definition of Maoism here.
Yeah, it's a great social dynamic where you're really trying, like, your primary concern is just living inside the head of the guy immediately on top of you, trying to figure out how precisely he's going to screw with you, office politics writ large. So at this point, after they sort of not merely solicit but demand criticism, there actually ends up being an enormous amount of criticism flowing in, millions of letters for however much that means for given how many Chinese people there are. Unfortunately, concurrently with this, you had things like the Hungarian Revolution and Khrushchev's secret speech, which sort of implied that maybe this kind of regime isn't actually as solid as they thought. So naturally, if you have a situation where you solicited criticism, you didn't get any, you demanded criticism, you got a bunch, you realize this was a bad idea, you find the people who are most critical and you gulag all of them. Which is just like it's a beautiful situation. Like it's never a great time to be a Chinese peasant, but it's almost as often not a great time to be a Chinese intellectual.
Well, when was the or where was the sort of famous trope about taking anybody who wears eyeglasses and putting them into the rice paddies to do manual labor, taking your intellectual class, as it were?
Well, the eyeglasses was class. Cambodia.
Yeah, I thought that might be. Did Mao do any of that?
Well,
later. Well, no, they did later, right? Remember, they sent people. We're getting ahead of ourselves, but they sent people from the urban centers to the countryside later. But yeah, that's a very important point. So the 100 Flowers thing, and it was tied to what was going on in Europe at the time. There was the very famous Berlin uprising, right? And then there was a Hungarian uprising, and initially Khrushchev was going to let the Hungarian thing, let them figure that out for themselves, right? And he actually consulted with Mao, and Mao said, he agreed. He said, yeah, they'll work it out. And Mao was, like you said, he said, okay, criticize us. And what Mao had anticipated would happen, and what he had insisted should happen, was that people should offer suggestions on the details, right, of how to make socialism work better in this peasant economy, how to achieve industrialization, but not question the basic premises of the system itself. And so, of course, predictably, that's exactly what happened, right, is that people started criticizing, the entire premise of socialism and, one-party rule and everything else. And so things were going south in Hungary, and we all know how that turned out. And Mao decided that things had, and the leadership decided that things had gone too far, and so then they immediately turned the 100 Flowers campaign. They turned that off, and then they launched what they called the anti-rightist campaign. And so all the very people who had been encouraged to speak up and to offer suggestions and everything else, they turned around and they denounced them. They forced them into struggle sessions. They executed a number of them, and so it was very much turnabout is fair play. And later on, Mao tried to retcon this, and he tried to say that all along that he had pushed the 100 Flowers campaign to get, the capitalist rotors, the secret net, Kuomintang stay-behinds and everything else to reveal themselves. But that was a lie. It backfired on him, and just about everything that Mao did from 1956 onwards basically backfired on him.
So I think that brings us up to the Great Leap Forward, which happens in 58. You talked in a fair amount of depth in your deep dive on FTN about the Great Leap Forward, so I don't know that we need to go into extreme depth there. But that was sort of a rapid industrialization campaign that went disastrously wrong and ended up killing about 30 million people in a state-enforced famine.
I think I've heard higher estimates, upwards of 70 million. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the written records at that time were not fantastic. So, I mean, at a certain point, it's like the harvest fails and like the entire village ends up turning into nomads searching for any calories that they can find.
But not only that, the active exporting of agricultural products to allied communist regimes was part of the reason they ran out of food, and they were using that to pay for importation of capital goods to industrialize the country.
Most of which they then squandered on inefficient implementations of heavy industry with the backyard furnaces. And
that's right. That's right. And Mao was trying to jumpstart industrialization and also to enforce collective farming at the same time, right? This is a traumatic event. Even though it's been hushed up and the official histories try to blame. They downplay the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government have never actually given an official figure, on their own as to how many people died, and they claim that there were like 3 bad years of harvest, is how they explain this. But yeah, so Mao wanted to instantly undo the land reform, and go to collective farming, and then tried to industrialize and tried get the people to do these backyard steel smelters, which is of course rubbish. And then he also launched what was called the 4 Pests campaign to deal, to telling people that they need to eradicate the rats and the sparrows, and I forget the other 2, because they were pests who ate grain. Right? Yeah, the locusts, and there was one other, but they were pests who ate grain, and so the sparrows were actually the easiest to deal with, and so you actually had squads of people wearing rubber-soled shoes, chasing after sparrows to kill them. And in the cities, this anti-sparrow campaign was so effective that you ended up with the few remaining sparrows taking shelter on the embassy grounds of foreign embassies in Beijing. And so like the Dutch embassy, for example, the Chicoms went to the Dutch and said, "Hey, we want to come on the grounds of your embassy to get rid of these sparrows." And the Dutch said, "No, absolutely not." And so what they did was they surrounded the Dutch embassy with this drum corps, beating drums and blowing whistles and making noise. And this kept the sparrows penned in, and they were scared to death and they starved to death. And so something like 10,000 sparrows ended up dying after about 4 or 5 days of this sonic campaign against them, and the entire grounds of the Dutch embassy were covered in sparrows. But anyway, they got rid of the sparrows, and of course the sparrows go after the locust, right? And so along with the man-made famine, by getting rid of the natural predator of the locust, they made things even worse. But this was a horrible time in China, and what happened was that Mao and the central government wanted they wanted to impose these unrealistic quotas on the farmers, and then the local party officials felt compelled to double down and say, well, we'll do double of this, and we'll double down again. And so they ended up with these grossly inflated quotas that they couldn't meet. And part of this was also a result of the fact that Mao came from a farming background, right? His family were wealthy farmers, and he knew that the peasants, always held back. They always set some of the harvest aside for their own use. And so that combined with his increasing megalomania led him to keep demanding, more and more. And then to show their loyalty, the cadres all the way down to the local level they keep upping the ante. And so you ended up in a situation where you actually had full granaries that they didn't allow people to go, to have the grain. And so people would crawl up on their last ergs of energy and surround the granary and call out, "Communist Party, Chairman Mao, help us," with their last breath before they died and expired on the spot. And you had cannibalism in China as well. You had actually party cadres taking human flesh home, boiled human flesh, to feed to their families. Most of them couldn't bear to eat it themselves. You had people dropping dead in the fields, and then the winter would come and the corpses would freeze, and then the next season the thaw would come, and so the corpses would thaw out and they would stink, and then there would be these big chunks missing from the thighs and the buttocks of the corpses. And the official explanation was that feral dogs were chewing on the corpses, but there were no feral dogs because the people had already eaten them, and so there were no dogs to be had. And you ultimately ended up with a phenomenon of the children exchange, where the peasants would take their children and exchange them with another family, because you see, they couldn't bear to kill and eat their own children. It was a little bit easier if they were eating somebody else's children.
That's terrifying.
And this is within the living memory of some of the older people who were still alive. So this was a huge trauma. And the thing is, it's not like, Mao didn't and the leadership of the party didn't know what was going on. They kept receiving reports of what was happening and kept up with the campaign. And so I've never seen this really substantiated anywhere, but my belief is that this was actually not so much a screw up on Mao's part as it was actually a deliberate policy. I believe that Mao, and he may not have planned on 70 million, right? But that he wanted to get rid of a big chunk of his population who remembered, pre-communist China. He was never a real Marxist-Leninist himself, right? He didn't know a lot about Marxism-Leninism. His main understanding of Marxism-Leninism came from Stalin's short course on Marxism-Leninism, and he didn't even read the entire book. He read the summaries, and he had one of his colleagues, Chen Boda, who kind of tutored him on Marxist economics. But what Mao really wanted to be was an emperor. He was the Red Emperor. And when he,
I think it even goes further than that. Like, in a lot of his actions, he's setting himself to be essentially a god. Like, he's trying to dictate the fundamental metaphysics of belief.
I mean, his face is still in the center of Tiananmen Square, which is the center of the world. If you really just look into the whole metaphysics and philosophy of Chinese thought, it's basically Beijing, the forbidden city.
Chinese
front is his face.
Were never really sort of deified, like you saw Roman emperors, with a few exceptions. Like, that was usually
it was much more extreme than that, but yes,
your sign that you've sort of lost the mandate of heaven once you start demanding people worship you as a living god. But I mean, you really don't get more megalomaniac than sort of dictating that you destroy the notion of capitalist thought.
Well, I have an example in that vein, Hank, actually. So he has a famous quote from Mao. It's something along the lines of seeds are happiest when they grow close together. So as you say in metaphysics, he's essentially, or really physics, he's redefining, applied physics, agriculture, so that when, deny the knowledge that people have accumulated about the proper distance that seeds should be placed for whatever the species is, to say, no, have these seeds planted close together, we can increase the density and thus increase the yield. It's madness.
No, it absolutely is. And, he really saw himself as the founder of a new dynasty more than anything else. He was also a poet. Did you guys know that he wrote poetry?
Just like Zedong.
Yeah. And his most famous poem,
Stalin,
White Snow.
For that matter.
Yeah, that's right. Let me read you his most famous poem here. He says, "How beautiful these mountains and rivers, enticing countless heroes to war and strive. Too bad that the emperors Qin Shi Huang and Han Wudi lacked culture, and that emperors Tang Taizong and Song Taizu lacked romance. Genghis Khan was the pride of his time, though he was only good at shooting eagles with his bow. They all belong to a time gone by. Only today is a true hero present. And of course, I guess you guys can figure out who the true hero is, right?
My apologies to any professional poets out there, but this sounds like a grade school level poem.
Well, it's translated into English, so there may be a greater level of poetry in Chinese.
True,
of course
but in terms of just the insight of what he's saying, it's basically a schoolboy's fantasy. I don't quite really see what he's saying beyond that.
Well, yeah, and one thing to understand about China too is that they've always had a love-hate relationship with their quote greatest rulers. So the Emperor Qin Shi Huang, for example, who unified China, is probably was the most hated figure in Chinese history. He's the guy who instituted legalism and everything else. We talked about this on the FTN Focus.
The terracotta warriors are his.
That's right. The terracotta warriors are his. And so people had been comparing, some of the people who were not happy with the Mao's growing consolidation of one-man rule were whispering and comparing him to Qin Shi Huang, who was the most hated figure in Chinese history. And so when Mao heard about this, what he did was, at the second plenum of the Eighth Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, it was held in 1958, he stood up and he said, Emperor Qin Shi Huang was not that outstanding. He only buried alive 460 Confucian scholars. We've buried 460,000 Confucian scholars. Some have accused us of being Emperor Qin Shi Huang. This is not true. We are 100 times worse than Emperor Qin. To the charge of being like Emperor Qin, of being a dictator, we plead guilty. But you have not said this nearly enough, for often we have to go further than he did. This is Mao.
Agree and amplify 101.
My mind,
really, if you look at how Mao functioned, just the ability to do mass manipulation of human psychology, it's just unparalleled. People, when you talk about, the dictator is the great manipulator, people think Hitler, because, he was on the radio a bunch. But, honestly, in comparison to, getting a sheer number of people exert a certain social dynamic where fundamentally what the end result of that social dynamic is going to be, he was a poser. There's no comparison to Mao in terms of getting your sort of will imposed not by direct command, but through kind of infinitesimal propagation through 90 levels of social strata to the peasants down in Yunnan or whatever.
Oh, that's a very, very powerful insight. The communist movement in China and the early stages of the People's Republic of China were very, very enthusiastically supported all the way down to the literal grassroots level. And even after all the upheavals that have come since, that is still true today. The Chinese people have a huge amount of ethnic and national pride. And because of that century of humiliation, and that they had almost given up hope that China would ever, be a real country, and Mao tapped into that, and that, along with the land reform and everything else, he fundamentally politicized the entire country in a way that it had not been politicized before, and that really no other large country had ever really been politicized to that degree before.
So I think we should talk about the steel fetishism a little bit, because that's a really crazy part of the Great Leap Forward. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. I can say some things.
Oh, I've got a lot, but why don't you go ahead?
So prior to 1960 or 1970, rather than looking at something like real GDP, an index of production basically across the entire economy, countries' industrial might was evaluated based on their steel production, just gross steel production. So you would compare the Soviet Union to Germany, to the United States, to the United Kingdom, based on their aggregate steel production. And so
it's still really fun to go and look through old editions of like world fact books where they publish this information in nice
the
little
CIA fact books will do that. Yeah. Jane's, I think I've seen it there. So he was obsessed with steel, kind of understandably. I mean, it's a really important basic industrial input to have. But the way that he went about getting it was, of course, these backyard steel mills or steel furnaces. And there have people living on these communal farms, communal farms. And they're essentially, what they end up doing is melting down their steel pots, their iron pots, their hose, their basic, agricultural
to supplement. I don't believe that was the complete, input that they were making steel out of.
Perhaps not.
Yeah,
but
it was supplemental, yes.
Yeah, but the point is that China had not much of an industrial base, right? So they inherited a little bit from the Japanese in the north, in a Heilongjiang, and they inherited a little bit from the Kuomintang regime on the coasts. They had, in the French and the British probably had something going, but they had a little bit of industry. But mostly they had this Iron Age agriculture economy. And then they bring it back to the Wood Age or the Stone Age by melting down their crappy, low-quality iron and steel tools. It's just a perfect Maoist case.
Well, I think what he was trying to do was, I mean, if you've ever watched a Stefan Molyneux video, he'll use this term tax farm, for your average mixed economy citizen, as the government uses them. But he was basically collectivizing the country to be a resource pool for his projects. And so what he was trying to do was basically suck up the resources of the peasantry into the communist system and then allocate that as he saw fit. And in terms of the industry, I've always sort of had a slightly broader definition of what industry includes. I would say it's basically the manufacture of goods, whether it's shoes or whatnot. But I think
transportation. Would you call transportation as well?
Well, I would call that a service. But I mean, I know that sometimes it's colloquially referred to as an industry. But in my definition, I would just say it's the manufacture of something.
Fair enough.
And yeah, what I would just to build on your point, I would say what he was trying to do was build heavy industry, which is what the Soviets were sort of famous for at that point, at least in the communist world. And they had adopted a lot of foreign.
They had huge prestige at this point.
Sure.
The Soviets. I mean, they produced 90,000 T-34s and 30,000 Joseph Stalin tanks. They were, their approach was credible.
Sure, absolutely. And this was, Mao was very focused on aping Stalin. He basically did most of the things that Stalin initiated something like 20 to 25 years later. More or less than after Stalin did them, but no, he very much wanted to pursue that same Soviet path and do it even more quickly. And so when Khrushchev gave his secret speech at the 20th Party Congress of the CPSU and denounced Stalin's cult of personality, Mao was very offended by this because he viewed the cult of personality and actually stated that the cult of personality was necessary in a country like China in order to be able to drag the backwards masses, as he called them, into the 20th century. So yeah, he was absolutely determined to do this. And so just like his entry into the Korean War was a matter of prestige, this obsession, with industrializing as quickly as possible was a matter of national prestige as well, and it can't be overstated how much Mao aped the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, Khrushchev claimed that they would overtake the United States in industrial output, I believe, by 1975, and so Mao immediately then says, "Oh, well, you know what? We'll overtake the UK by 1975." So it was a very slavish imitation up to a point.
And I think he had mentioned America also, and I don't know what the timeline was for that passing point, but that happened a long time ago. I mean, as of now, or at least as of a few years ago when I still was reading statistics on this, China makes half the world's steel. In terms of quality, they're not as high as you'd find in like a Korean rolling mill or something like that, but The primary output of their steel is structural and for piping and things like that. Basically, their construction industry feeds on this stuff. And I think part of the communist system today, and it's sort of like quasi-socialism with Chinese characteristics, as they call it, but quasi-capitalist in a sense, is that they set these still kind of like communistic targets for their localities, being, a province or a city even with 4 million people. I mean, just, by Chinese standards, that's small, but you'll get these mayors who today will travel around the world visiting whatever city they want to emulate, and then they'll basically go back to China and then get the government banks to lend them money to build these gigantic apparatuses of industry and construction to basically meet their growth targets. And then the Communist Party rewards them for meeting growth targets. And so they have GDP targeting, basically, and that's how they propelled themselves to the height of the world's largest steelmaker. But as I said, it's not necessarily quality, it's more quantity. And I think that probably has its origins with Mao.
It does. And not just steel either, aluminum, for example. They're major players in the heavy metals industry, and because it's viewed, these are the building blocks of physical things in the physical world. It has a lot of prestige, and you're also right that there is decentralization in the sense that you have the provincial mayors and governors, reaching out to do business. Xi Jinping, for example, was very active in courting Liverpool and other localities in the UK to figure out how they could do business together. But we were getting ahead of ourselves. But yes, your point is correct.
So post the Great Leap Forward, it's sort of apparent within the leadership structure that things have not gone according to plan. And Mao withdraws, I guess, as head of state. He's still chairman of the Communist Party. He's not the general secretary, and a lot of these titles are sort of, tokens of appreciation more than representations of some sort of institutional power. His prestige, though, is still large and actually growing. Like, he's almost treated, even in the midst of this disaster, it's not like he was sort of imposing a lot of these ideas. Like, this was the actual consensus of the Chinese Communist Party at the time, and they were happy to sort of promote him as this cultic figure, as this great leader who had won the war against the Japanese and the Long March and the Korean War and everything else. But he sort of
manifested in the Little Red Book.
Oh, so
we're
getting there. So he goes into this period of withdrawal around kind of 1959 or so. But being kind of an aspiring dictator, if you're looking for a social circle, you really, really, really want to be friends with the army. So he's best friends with the Minister of Defense at the time, Marshal Lin Bao, or Biao, however one pronounces that.
BAO? Is it BAO?
Yes, or BIAO. The organization is all
Biao then.
Here. And
Lin Bao, who was the primary general who won the Chinese Civil War for Mao, right?
Right. And over the course of a couple of years, he sort of develops a lot of the kind of aspects of these kind of core signifiers of Maoism. So they start doing things in this kind of 1962 to 65 time frame. Like, they begin organizing these production brigades where you'll get a bunch of people together and sort of organize them for some heroic feat of labor, or you'll get 10,000 people together and they'll build a 100-kilometer road in a day or something like that. They start creating these kind of political study groups, self-criticism junkets, these struggle sessions within the actual army units. And in 1963, they start publishing and disseminating this little red book of Maoist quotations, which there are kind of multiple versions of that floating around that don't really matter. But they sort of use it almost as a prototyping ground, like a testing ground for this social engineering project of like, okay, so we have this kind of captive audience. How do we get them to kind of discard these capitalist modes of thought, these old ideas, these old ideologies, and kind of metaphysically, mentally, emotionally remake them into perfect Maoist exemplars? And this is sort of taken on its terms, I guess, a success. And that leads us into the kind of efforts to propagate these ideas from the context of an army where, they're all being kind of fed from external sources to society at large, where you don't have nearly as much freedom of action. This is kind of the first phase of the cultural revolution as it propagates into society.
So Mao was he was actively plotting during that withdrawal period. He had been busy denouncing Khrushchev and the Soviets as revisionists, and he really stepped that rhetoric up in 1960. He went after the Yugoslavs. The Soviets in turn went after the Albanians, which Enver Hoxha and the Albanians were actually very ideologically aligned with Mao within the communist bloc. And he, when the reports of the Great Famine that were caused by the Great Leap Forward the clamor became too loud to ignore, the party leadership sent these cadres down to, quote, investigate, unquote, and understand supposedly what was happening, when in reality the leadership knew exactly what was happening all along. And Mao essentially flipped the script and blamed the disruptions and the problems that they acknowledged of the Great Leap Forward. He blamed it on the party cadres and was insisting that they were must be ideologically aligned with Moscow, that they were revisionists, discarding the legacy of the great Stalin. And there had been this discontent with Mao. People like Peng Dehuai had openly defied him, which he was not used to. And so he basically conceived the notion of an auto coup, a self coup, where he would simply smash the party apparatus, or most of it, and then rebuild it from scratch. And that was a big part of the Cultural Revolution, was to do exactly that.
Yeah, and I think that's like, that really, when you say what is Maoism, and, you can go full on Marxist, Leninist, tanky-tard with this whole thing. You can talk about like, the peasants versus the working class and like guerrilla warfare and all these things. If I was going to sum up Maoism, it would be just as you just said. It's the fact that when you don't control an institution, the best thing to do is to assemble a mob or create a mob dynamic to destroy that institution and make sure you're in charge of that mob once the fires die down. So this sort of kicks off, like, people usually talk about the kind of opening shot of this campaign when he tries to sort of use the Shanghai Party, which was kind of this, kind of a sideshow, I guess, at this time, to destroy the Beijing Party. And he kicks this off by this sort of like bizarre in my mind, and I'm sure in the minds of a lot of our viewers, the literary criticism campaign. So there's this particular allegorical play that that the vice mayor of Beijing had written about some bureaucratic official who screws up and gets fired. Which, if you read it through the right lens, you can see it as an attack on Mao and his various screw-ups. So he organizes this like literary criticism mob attack to try to attack the vice mayor. And this is smart because you never want to go after the guy. You always want to go after the guy's allies in order to try to make him toxic, deprive him of support, make sure that anybody who looks at, okay, well, should I help this guy out? Now, look at what happened the last time to the last guy that did that. It's very similar to actually what is currently being attempted against Donald Trump, where all of his allies are being targeted for assassination. But that's the digression. So they rely on the sort of captive Shanghai party to send a bunch of mobs, both literal and metaphorical, to try to take out the vice mayor, and then to kind of go from there to escalate the criticism after that victory, get rid of the actual mayor, and sort of work their way up from there. So they start doing things like giving free travel to students, where, like, here's a train pass, you can go to Beijing, away from your hometown, and stir up some shit, and nobody will hold you to account.
And is this where you see those famous videos of just these teeming hordes of young people holding Mao's Red Book in Tiananmen Square? Is this sort of around that period?
Yeah, this is when it starts to ramp up. Like, this whole thing actually sort of escalates very dramatically because he starts involving a lot of groups that hadn't previously been involved in politics, that hadn't been sort of like core party cadres. And there's this dynamic when you have like an entirely state-run system. The blog that Spandrel runs describes this dynamic very well, where everybody's sort of trying to infer what is expected of them from the guy above, because, of course, like, they don't want to be left out in the cold, and they're using that expectation to try to punish, to try to get one over, to secure advantage over all of their comrades and underlings. So when you have the kind of dynamic where you have some student class, and they've been told, okay, we have a problem with all of these reactionaries, and here's some free train passes. We need you to go to Beijing, and we got to do something about these reactionaries. They're starting a lot of problems, but only 10 of the 20 of you can go. So try to figure out amongst yourselves who's the least reactionary, and everybody gets on the train, and we'll see how things kind of work out when you get there. Don't worry about lodging; that's taken care of. And the police won't give you too much trouble. Basically, do as thou wilt will be the whole of the law. You kind of see how things might start to escalate a little bit, and how you might have this sort of, as it's described, signaling spiral, where you start having these grotesque displays of, who can do the loyalty dance the hardest, who can recite the best Mao quotes.
And even that won't always be enough. One of my favorite sayings from this period is raise the red flag to oppose the red flag.
That's
so
deep.
You
Very
can you can be screwed if you just, I don't know, you piss the wrong person off. It doesn't really matter what you do, how much you quote Mao. You could just be quoting Mao because you seek to later oppose Mao or oppose the revolution.
That's exactly what happened, because all of this was done in the name of Mao, right? And so one of Mao's quote innovations, unquote, in Marxism-Leninism was, we had a concept of the general party line, or shorthand the party line. What is the line of the Communist Party on the given issues of the day, right? Mao had this concept of the mass line. And this actually originated out of one of his, he had criticisms of Stalin. And one of his criticisms of Stalin was that Stalin wanted to dictate to the masses, the peasant masses, too much and didn't want to reflect their will. And so he developed this idea of the mass line. And so the idea with the mass line is that what happens is that the leadership of the Communist Party of China gets the sense, from the peasantry of what it is that they want, and then takes that and reflects it back to them, and amplifies it and then implements it. And so, it's all nonsense, of course, right? But yeah, this is what he did, and he used students. And actually, so these student campaigns, they always start in China with wall posters. And so what they would do is they'd make these wall posters and they put them up on the wall, the university walls, these different, the different issues that they were concerned about. And so that's how it gets started. And so you ended up with the formation of what were called the Red Guards. And of course you had extreme factionalism and, who's a left deviationist and who's a right deviationist and so on and so forth. But the idea was to basically pull down the existing party apparatus, and these younger people would get involved in whipping up mass discontent. They would drag party officials and local government officials out of their offices and subject them to these, they call them struggle sessions, where, people would hurl all kinds of insults at the supposed, nationalist stay-behinds and capitalist rotors and right deviationists and imperialist lackeys, and force them to confess. And sometimes they would beat them to death. Sometimes they would just torture them. But and there was a subgroup that was formed to kind of manage all this, separate from the Politburo and separate from the Central Committee. And Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, was involved in this. She was, I think, his third or fourth wife, and the party disapproved of her when he married her. She was like
she was an actress thought.
Yeah, and not a well-known actress as well, right? But she was a frustrated actress. She thought the people in the Chinese nascent film industry had been holding her back, and so the deal was made that he'll marry her, but she'll stay out of politics. But he decided to turn her loose at this point, and so she actually ended up playing, a Madame Defarge-like role in all of this. And of course, underneath it all, she's waging war on all the different people she thought held back her otherwise, would have been brilliant acting career and, kept her out of politics and everything else. But she was one of the major leaders of getting these groups going. And Zhou Enlai was also involved, but his role was actually, he was trying quietly to contain it and to lessen the damage as much as he could. But they absolutely ended up doing this. And then they ended up with these different factions fighting one another. And then Mao ordered the army to open up the armories to equip these different factions. And so now they have machine guns. Now they have mortars. They even got a hold of some artillery. And so, going from, mobs throwing rocks at one another and engaging, and forcing these politicians and party cadres through struggle sessions and everything else, you actually end up with whole city blocks being destroyed by these rival, literal social justice warrior factions using heavy weapons against one another in the city centers.
If you want a sense for like the kind of like raw, weird horror of this thing, like look up some of the actual footage from someplace like Evergreen State College, where you basically had a mob take over the college, drag professors out of their classes, demand that they check their privilege and engage in these struggle sessions. Now imagine if those same mobs had state backing and had just looted the National Guard armory and weren't particularly concerned with what structures were left standing because, we'll be back in our village in a couple months.
So it's like modern America, where instead of the failed actresses being relatively powerless, over the hill actresses being relatively powerless, and the social justice jihadis being relatively powerless, they have heavy weapons and they're married to the dictator.
Bingo.
That's exactly right. And we're actually partway there. They haven't given heavy weapons to Antifa yet, but who knows, right?
Inshallah.
Well, they got flamethrowers, they got concrete in bottles. What else they got? Yeah, we're getting there.
Yeah, I can't say I'd personally be much opposed to the Schadenfreude that would come with watching these leftist professors get thrown out of their own classroom windows.
In Minecraft, of course.
In Minecraft.
Yeah. But yeah, absolutely. And so this rages, and we could spend hours just on the Cultural Revolution, because there's all this very intricate infighting and switching from the red flag faction to this other faction, and and there were inter-university rivalries were involved in some of this. It just goes on, but it was tearing the country apart, and eventually China essentially became ungovernable, and you actually ended up outside of Beijing. You ended up sometimes with local military units siding with one faction or with another faction, and this is getting really really dangerous. And so at some point, things have to be reined in, and so this is where you essentially ended up with a period of almost military dictatorship in China, because eventually Mao called on the army to step in and impose order, and they ended up replacing a lot of party cadres and officials with army officers. And at one point, I believe you had something like 12 Politburo members were actually uniformed military officials, and so and there was still a lot of infighting, literal infighting that's going on. And during all of this, China are involved in supporting logistically the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. And then in 1969, you have a border dispute with the Soviet Union that was, it turns into a shooting skirmish, and the Soviets were actually getting ready to nuke China. Nixon ended up dissuading them from doing that, and China had been promised a nuclear weapon, an actual working prototype bomb by the Soviets. But then when they saw how crazy things were getting with the Cultural Revolution, they reneged, and this enraged Mao. They still gave him logistical and scientific support, and the Chi-Coms ended up exploding their own weapon. What was it, 1964, 1965 at Lop Nor. So they eventually got their own nuclear weapons, which is a huge amount, prestige thing as well. But this is all going on this whole time, and this is why in the Chinese cultural psyche there is a huge fear of disorder. That is the number one aspect, I would say, of the Chinese cultural psyche. And again, this is not just because of the Cultural Revolution. It's not just because of the Great Leap Forward or World War II or anything else. This goes back, thousands of years. Is that most of the worst things that have happened in human history have happened in China. And as a result of this fear of disorder is the overriding cultural characteristic of the Chinese people. And so there is a yearning for order, to know one's place under heaven. And Mao, deliberately shattered all of that to try to remake the party as very much his own personal fiefdom. And there were a lot of people who had been on the Long March with him, who had fought in the Chinese Civil War with him, whom he got rid of, and then Lin Bao, who he wouldn't have won the Civil War without Lin Bao. Eventually, he turned on Lin Bao, and Lin Bao and his family ended up getting on a plane. They were trying to defect to the Soviet Union, and the plane supposedly ran out of fuel and crashed in Mongolia. And Lin Bao at that time was Mao's formal, his Rudolf Hess, his anointed successor. So this is just a tremendous amount of upheaval. And Zhou Enlai was in the background trying to keep the brakes on this. Deng Xiaoping was as well, and of course, that he ended up being exiled for a while because of it. But it was just a crazy period. And in the West, people didn't really understand what was going on, and even in the Soviet Union, they didn't really and truly understand the degree of what was going on, or they might have made a move against China in the late 1960s, irrespective of what Nixon said.
Well, you mentioned Lin Biao and Mao's wife. They were both, Lin Biao was not per se part of the Gang of Four, but could you talk a little bit about the Gang of Four and how they fell out with how they ended up being labeled counter-revolutionary forces?
Was this the original Gang of? You know how there's different gangs of?
Yeah, Gang of Eight. Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, I always thought that was funny how the American terminology was, I guess, implicitly derived from the Chinese Maoist Gang of Four.
Sure. So and the gang, in numbers, you see numerology is a very important concept in the animistic religion that pretty much all Chinese subscribe to, whether they admit it or not.
But the number 4 is not a lucky number in their language.
It's not a lucky number. It's not a lucky number at all. But
sounds like death. Right?
Yeah, and so is the number 14. I think is also.
It translates roughly to want death if you say 14 in an archaic way.
Right. But they had this Gang of Four, and so the leader was Jiang Qing, right? Madame Mao, and he had Zhang Chengguo, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hanweng, and so they were leading the charge during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And I mean, Mao was with them. It's not like they were doing stuff that Mao didn't approve of or didn't want them to do. And of course, the downfall of the Gang of Four came after the death of Zhou Enlai and the death of Mao, and that's when they ended up being arrested and getting in trouble. But yeah, they were the vanguard of the social justice warrior Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution, and were absolutely just rabid in their exhortations of these young people to kill and tear down party officials and local officials, and they switched which factions they would support many different times. So somebody who was part of a favored faction one day would end up being a capitalist rotor,
Running Dog.
Yeah. All
Running Dog is one of my favorite ones. If anyone wants to see read a firsthand account, a really harrowing firsthand account of the Red Guards, I would recommend the book Life and Death in Shanghai. It's a good book.
Yeah. So that's who the Gang of Four were, and they ended up ultimately being arrested and given suspended death sentences after Zhou Enlai died, and then after Mao died. And when they were put on trial, this was just amazing. The Chinese Communist Party actually televised this, and U.S. television picked it up. And so I think it was 1979, 1980, when they were actually put on trial, and you could actually watch this on U.S. television. It was actually absolutely astounding.
Do we want to talk about the American relationship with China before and after the Nixon visit?
Sure.
Well, my understanding was the main reason Nixon went over there was beyond sort of playing to sort of the domestic political strategy in America. He wanted to sort of checkmate the Soviets by taking away their sort of principal ally or counterpart in the communist world away from them and reposition America and China against the Soviets. Is that correct?
More or less. I mean, so the Sino-Soviet split had already taken place, and the Soviet Union and the Chinese would cooperate to a certain degree. They were actually rival cooperators during the Vietnam War, right? They both were supplying the North Vietnamese, but doing it as rivals, to try to establish leadership of the independence, national liberation movements. And so Khrushchev and Mao were struggling for who was going to have preeminence in the international communist movement in the third world, as it were. A lot of people within the U.S. intelligence community, Western intelligence community, believed somehow that the Sino-Soviet split was a trick, right? That it was a big maskirovka, as it were. But Nixon,
who unrivaled record of really getting it right and getting it right on time.
Absolutely. And Nixon knew this better. Nixon actually knew a great deal about communism. He's actually he and Thomas Jefferson are the two most intellectual American presidents we've ever had. And of course, Nixon professed that he hated intellectuals or eggheads. He was actually an intellectual himself. But
that's
he
what
understood.
Milton Friedman said, that Nixon had the highest IQ of any president that he'd met, and he would have known.
That's right. And so Nixon was aware of all of this stuff going on. And again, the Soviets actually came to the Nixon administration to say, look, we're about to nuke the Chi-Coms, so don't nuke us because we're going to nuke them. And Nixon was like, no, don't do that. Blah, blah, blah. And he and Kissinger realized that because of this very, very serious issue, they realized the Sino-Soviet split was a real thing and it was likely to be a permanent thing. And so in trying to push for détente and at the same time try to retain some kind of fiscal discipline with regards to arms expenditures, what Nixon and Kissinger decided to do was to try to engage with the Chinese, because if they could get the Chinese on side as an ally, this would end up tying up essentially about 1/3 of the Soviet Union's armed forces. And from the Chinese perspective, they had the same idea. They actively wanted to collaborate with the Americans. And remember, they had fought a hot war against the United States, in the 1950s, the Korean War, right? And were very stridently anti-American in their rhetoric throughout their educational system, with their propaganda and everything else. But Mao and Zhou Enlai decided that they thought that they wanted rapprochement with America because they viewed the United States and the West as losing the Cold War. They thought America was losing the Cold War, and they didn't want that to happen because the Chinese wanted to use the United States and the West as a counterweight against the Soviet Union. And so that's how this came about. And the hoary cliche by now, only Nixon, the famous anti-communist who had put Alger Hiss in jail, could go to China. This is what happened. This is where the term shuttle diplomacy came from, with Henry Kissinger going back and forth between Washington and Beijing and having all these meetings that led to Richard Nixon's state visit to China. So yeah, both sides wanted to use the other as a counterweight to the Soviet Union, and the Chinese thought that the West was going to lose and didn't want that to happen. So that's how it worked out, how it came up to be.
That whole episode is just so strange, because Nixon, if anything, he was essentially personal friends with Khrushchev, and had quite a good relationship with the man. And obviously, they're friends, and the end result of normalizing relations with China was that we ended up shipping much of our heavy industry essentially to China. And, in retrospect, it may have been a big disaster, or at least a blunder.
I agree with
Sometimes you
the
do defense coordination doesn't mean that you have to be best friends economically or vice versa.
Right.
I don't think there was any sort of trade component at all to the negotiations.
You have to wait for
Not
Deng
at that
Xiaoping.
time. It's very much in retrospect, that I think that we realize this. But what you said about Nixon having a good relationship with Khrushchev, that's actually true. And this is something that I think a lot of people some more hidden history here. Jack Kennedy is lionized. It's just supposedly this great young, vigorous president, and he's a Democrat. Yeah, and he stood up to the Soviets, you know, and you know the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything else. The reality was that he was a very vapid playboy who should never have been elected president of the United States. He was dangerously weak. You know, Khrushchev just, you know, basically beat the hell out of him verbally the first time they met in Berlin. His perceived weakness was a big reason the Berlin Wall went up. And when he during the 1960 election, Kennedy actually ended up running to the right of Dick Nixon during the 1960 election, talking about a supposed bomber gap and a missile gap and everything else. And it wasn't true. Now, Nixon, as vice president, he knew this wasn't true, but he couldn't say anything about it because it would be revealing United States reconnaissance and intelligence collection capabilities that we understood, you know, despite Khrushchev's claims that he was, you know, churning out ICBMs like sausages and everything else, that they only had like, you know, 4 operational liquid fueled ICBMs that were unreliable at the time.
I think I misspoke. I meant Brezhnev, not Khrushchev, with Nixon being friends.
Okay, but the thing is, Nixon actually saw that there was a chance for potentially a rapprochement with the Soviet Union, but Jack Kennedy ran to the right of him on this and ended up, you know, stealing the election. The first election in U.S. history, I think, that was actually stolen was the 1960 election. And as a result
Texas
of this,
votes with
West Virginia, Illinois,
Johnson,
yeah. So basically, there had been an opportunity to potentially have glasnost and perestroika in the early 1960s that was thrown away by Jack Kennedy. So sorry about that. Keep going.
Yeah, well, there's no interest in having any sort of détente with the Soviet Union, right? Like the military-industrial complex does not want that. They want a big bad enemy. That's sort of why they're drumming up trouble with, or attempting to drum up trouble with Russia now, because Russia can serve as a big enemy. There's not a whole lot of trade with Russia, whereas China, who's actually an obvious massive threat to the U.S. empire, we do a lot of trade with them, and the oligarchy makes a lot of money making deals with China.
Sure, but at any rate, So Nixon very much wanted to balance out the Soviet Union. The Soviets wanted the Chinese wanted to balance out the Soviet Union, and so that's how détente came about. But when we talk about the economic stuff, that was Deng Xiaoping, you know, who ultimately ended up pushing that and making that a reality. And you know, Deng had been in favor and out of favor, and in favor and out of favor, at the end of the Cultural Revolution and towards the end of Mao's life, he had been pulled back in by Mao again, and he actually began laying the underpinnings to get ready for economic openness and engagement with the West. And when the SJWs, you know, the culture warriors figured out, you know, they denounced him and Mao put him back in the box. But this was Deng getting ready for the great economic opening. And so, you know, if we look at this in summation, I think that Mao can personally be held responsible for close to about 100 million deaths overall. You remember when the Black Book of Communism came out, and you know the calculation was that communism had cost about 110 million deaths. That was actually a low estimate. Mao alone was.
Some people would dispute that. Some people think that book is inflated. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I understand. They're wrong. Communism has killed more people than all the religious wars of history put together. And Mao Zedong himself is responsible for close to 100 million deaths. He completely, disrupted Chinese society. You know, you had cannibalism. You had all of these horrible, horrible things taking place, and mass cultural psychosis. People not knowing where the mass line was going to be from one day to another. But in a very perverse way, it's almost monstrous, really. If Mao had not smashed the state, if Mao had not subjected the Chinese to this unrelenting reign of terror that completely, destroyed the existing institutions and pushed them even more towards wanting continuity and stability, Deng's opening to the West would probably never have been possible. What would have happened instead is that because the Soviet Union, they were moving, into the Brezhnev era, right? The era of stagnation, and it seems that China and Mao were intent on aping the Soviet Union in just about everything that they did. And looking at the way that the economy was moving and everything else, you may well have ended up with a China that ended up being Brezhnevified. And, who knows what would happen next. But certainly the strong, dynamic China that we see today would never have been possible unless Mao had done all of these horrible, evil things and smashed the state. And I think that's actually one of the great ironies of history that's largely unrecognized.
for